The prairie wind howled like a warning no one heard. Midnight painted the desert plains in a palette of ash. And silence as the iron beast thundered through the darkness. A passenger train headed west. From Cheyenne to the mining towns beyond. Dead River Pass. It carried more than just hopeful settlers and silver shipments. It carried stories, secrets, and in one coach, redemption cloaked in silence. Somewhere near the canyon's edge, just past the broken telegraph wires and the lone pine tree that marked outlaw territory, the train slowed. No whistle, no reason, just a jarring screech that sent luggage tumbling and hearts racing. Horses waited in the dark while riders with burlap masks and cocked rifles. The Red Gorge Gang, feared from Missouri to Montana, rode out of nowhere like smoke and shadow. They'd hit a dozen rail cars into months. But this one would be different. As the conductor was dragged from the engine and passengers screamed behind velvet drapes, a quiet figure stood in the last car. He had boarded in silence at a ghost town depot with a weathered saddlebag and a single silver coin. No name, no voice. Just eyes that had seen war, betrayal, and fortune. He wore a poncho stitched with tribal patterns, and beneath his wide-brimmed hat no one knew yet a Cherokee bloodline older than the frontier itself pulsed with purpose. His boots were worn, but his silence carried weight. He hadn't come for gold. He had come for justice. The bandits stormed car after car, demanding silver, dragging women by their hair, pistol-whipping men who resisted. A preacher was thrown onto broken glass for clutching his cross. A war widow had her locket snatched from her neck. A child's scream echoed as one of the outlaws kicked open the cargo hold, unleashing crates of dynamite they planned to use for more than just robbery. They didn't want the train, they wanted the tracks, the tunnel, and the next supply run. This was no petty heist. It was war on the rails. But justice was watching. As the last car's door creaked open, the masked outlaw at the front of the pack stepped in only to be met with a gloved fist to the throat, silent and precise. The second fell with a blade so fast it caught moonlight mid-swing. And when the third raised his rifle, he never saw the boot that crushed his wrist. 3. Down, 9 to go. The stranger didn't speak. He moved like smoke, silent, fast, ruthless. It wasn't until the train lurched forward, unmanned and wild, that the passengers realized someone was fighting back. They didn't know his name, but survivors would later say they remembered the way the moon caught on his silver belt buckle, shaped like an eagle with wings stretched wide. A symbol not just of wealth, but of legacy. They'd also remember how he never once fired a shot to kill, only to disable, disarm again. Precision wasn't learned. It was inherited. Some say he came for the gold that was hidden beneath the coal. Others say he followed the Red Gorge Gang for revenge. But the truth was darker. One of the passengers, an old woman clutching a faded photo of a son, lost in the trail of tears, recognized the mark on his glove, a tribal sigil once worn by her people's fiercest warriors. And suddenly, it made sense. He wasn't a man. He was a reckoning. By the time the train reached the abandoned outpost near Pine Hollow, the masked millionaire was gone. The outlaws, all 12, lay bound on the cargo floor. Not dead, but silent, bruised, and broken in spirit. The passengers wept, hugged, and whispered the name of a man none of them knew. But he had left something behind, a badge. Not a sheriff's star, but a Cherokee chief's mark of honor. The same badge the government had buried decades ago when the land was stolen and the treaties burned. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a message. Some said the stranger vanished into the hills. Others claimed he rode a black stallion that left no tracks. But one thing was certain. The land had called for justice. And justice had answered with hands carved from history. And now, as the sun rose over the broken rail, one question echoed across the frontier like a warning shot. Who was the masked Cherokee, and why had he returned? If you believe justice still has a place in forgotten lands, hit like, subscribe, And stay with us because what happens next on this journey of redemption will shake every town. West of the Mississippi, long before the masked stranger boarded the midnight train, before bullets danced in the dark, and before the passengers whispered legends into dawn, there was fire. Not the kind that warmed hands or lit cabins, but the kind that devoured homes, treaties, and truth. It had started 30 years ago, in a Cherokee village that no longer appeared on maps. They called it Nokosi Ridgewolf Ridge in English, but even the wolves had forgotten it after the flames. Government officials had promised railroads, partnerships, and profit, but what they delivered was eviction, under the guise of progress. Soldiers arrived with scrolls bearing signatures forged in back rooms, backed by laws no elder had ever agreed to. Those who resisted were labeled threats. One by one, families vanished, some to relocation camps, others into graves marked only by wind. Among those ashes walked a boy, barely 12, holding the scorched drum of his grandfather. That night, he lost everything: his name, his family, and his home. But he didn't cry. He didn't beg. Instead, he watched the soldiers ride off with stolen timber, iron tools, and even the copper artifacts from his people's ceremonial lodge. That boy never forgot the smell of burning history, nor did he forget the badge his father threw into, the fire, a symbol of leadership crushed by betrayal. They thought they had erased him, but instead, they forged him. He wandered through territories wearing other names, doing other people's labor. He cleaned rifles for fur traders, hauled crates for steamboat captains, and mapped mining veins for barons who laughed at his silence. They never asked where he came from, just how steady his hands were, and steady they were. He learned to break horses without rope, read ledgers faster than the white men who owned them, and soon discovered something: the soldiers hadn't destroyed his mind. By the time he turned 25, the quiet boy had become a ghost in suits. His silence made people underestimate him, and that became his weapon. With gold from old Spanish mines and oil found beneath cursed land no settler dared drill, he built an empire with no name, one that moved in the shadows, buying banks under aliases, reclaiming land through straw men, and sending money back to Cherokee elders who had once raised him with stories of thunder spirits and broken treaties. But he never showed his face, not until the Red Gorge Gang. They had started with banks, then they raided mail wagons, then trains. But their last robbery had crossed a line, the one train carrying Cherokee children on a scholarship journey to a new school in the South. The bandits had taken every cent, every book, and left the children tied to posts with "not American enough" carved into their luggage. That was the moment the millionaire reached for his old poncho. That was when he became the masked man. Now, days after the train ambush, he stopped with bare hands and silence. Towns whispered of a lone rider. Ranchers swore they saw a cloaked figure on the ridge near Storm Bluff. Miners said a masked man bought a whole rail company in gold. And in the town of Clearwater, a widow walked out to find a deed on her porch restoring her late husband's stolen acres. No one signed it, but the seal at the bottom was unmistakable: an eagle carved from obsidian, wings stretched in vengeance. Sheriffs didn't know whether to thank him or hunt him. Politicians panicked as stories reached Washington of a native man outbidding tycoons and rewriting land ownership with receipts older than their laws. But the people, those who had lost farms to trickery, children to injustice, and lands to blood, they didn't ask questions. They lit candles on their porches. They passed stories. By firelight, they carved new songs into wood. Frontier redemption, they called it. But one man didn't light candles. He lit cigars with old maps and laughed in a saloon guarded by men with state-issued rifles. His name was Everett Banning, president of the largest rail syndicate west of the Mississippi, the Red Gorge Gang. Rumor said they worked for him. The dynamite shipments traced to his warehouses. The train schedules the bandits knew by heart, all copied from his locked safes. And now someone was targeting his empire. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in threats. And as he stared at the silent envelope delivered to his desk sealed in wax, bearing the eagle again, he realized something chilling. This wasn't over. The man he once displaced had returned, not with war cries or lawsuits, but with precision, with wealth, with purpose. And with every passing hour, the line between outlaw and hero blurred. Because on these lands, justice had no uniform anymore. Only shadows, only silence, and only one name the wind dared whisper. Clearwater was a quiet town on the edge of relevance, far enough from the capital to escape attention, but close enough to corruption to sell its soul. Its sheriff, a man named Hollis Dent, wore a badge but served only those who signed his paycheck. And in that town, every check carried the initials E.B. Everett Benning, a name that made landlords generous, judges blind, and school teachers afraid to mention Cherokee history in class. They said Clearwater had grown fast, but its roots were poisoned. The lumber mill paid in tokens, not cash. The church doubled as a courtroom where confessions meant eviction, and the orphanage on the hill, a warehouse where children with native bloodlines quietly disappeared. It was a town of pretty storefronts and ugly silences. And on the morning the masked Cherokee's story reached their newspaper's front page, everything started to unravel. No one had seen him, but everyone felt him. A letter appeared on the courthouse door, unsigned, unsealed, but filled with names, real names. Names of families who had their land taken under false pretenses. Attached were copies of deeds, witness testimonies, even hand-drawn maps showing how the town's church stood on stolen Cherokee soil. People stared at it for hours, unsure whether to believe, afraid to hope. Sheriff Dent tore it down by noon, but it was too late. Whispers spread like brush fire, and in Clearwater, whispers were more dangerous than bullets. A young woman named Alma, a seamstress whose shop was built on what used to be tribal farmland, found a leather pouch beside her doorstep. Inside was gold, enough to pay her debts, repair her roof, and feed her family for a year. But more than that, there was a note, written in hand-carved Cherokee script. It read only, "Give back what they took from you. The land remembers." She wept, not because of the gold, but because the handwriting was the same as her grandfather's who had died at Nokosi, rich elsewhere in town. A lawyer who once forged land documents for Everett Banning found his office burned to ash. No bodies, no threats, just a single eagle feather nailed to the charred doorframe. He left Clearwater that night and never returned. And then the train. It arrived unannounced, an old steam engine that hadn't run in years. No schedule, no passengers, just crates of food, medicine, and books, all labeled in both English and Cherokee. It parked on the side rail and stayed there like a silent protest, a gift, a warning, and a symbol. Everett Banning's fury was quiet but deep. He didn't send men this time. He sent lawyers. Suits filed against unknown indigenous saboteurs hit courts in 3 territories. The word treason was whispered in high places. Banning knew how to twist fear into policy. And now, he played his oldest trick, branding the righteous as dangerous. But the masked Cherokee was ready. He began using an alias, one he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Nokosi Eagleton. On paper, he became a land investor. In silence, he became a storm. Every stolen plot he exposed, he replaced with a letter of reclamation. Every child who had been orphaned by the rail wars, he sent to private schools in the north. He paid every debt owed by the victims of Clearwater's lies, using money hidden behind shell companies even the federal marshals couldn't trace. And then came the ledger. One night, in the vaults of a collapsing mining company in Dead River Pass, a safe was opened. Inside, bundled in oilcloth, was a black leather ledger. Dates, deals, names, including Everett Banning's. It revealed how he had paid the Red Gorge gang to sabotage competing rail lines under the cover of bandit attacks. The ledger showed bribes, forged deeds, assassinations. It was enough to burn down half the West, and it was now in the masked Cherokee's hands. But exposing it wasn't the plan. He wanted justice, not noise. Redemption, not revenge. So he sent a copy to the only person who still believed in law, Judge Alice Grantham, a woman whose own father had disappeared after refusing to sign Banning's land deals. She received the copy by mail. No return address. Just one sentence written at the bottom of the final page. They took your father's voice, but they cannot take your gavel. Clearwater woke up different the next morning. The air felt heavier. The church was empty. Sheriff Dent was gone, and a message had been burned into the field outside town, visible from the hills where the train had once stalled. Truth rides the rails now. The masked Cherokee hadn't returned to seek applause. He had returned because the land remembered, because treaties buried in fire don't stay dead, because some ghosts don't haunt, they rebuild. And as wind carried dust across Clearwater's streets, those who had built their homes on lies began to wonder, what else had the fire left behind? Far from the crumbling towns and haunted train tracks, Everett Banning sat in his mahogany study, surrounded by oil paintings of men who conquered mountains, but never paid for the soil they stood on. His mansion overlooked Silverback Valley, a stretch of land once belonging to Cherokee families, who were erased from the records after a mysterious fire swept their village clean. Now, it was a private estate. 50 rooms, marble, staircases, gold faucets. But beneath it all, one truth remained: he had built his kingdom on stolen rails. The mansion's cellar held what he never showed guests: a private archive. Deeds, ledgers, photographs, a room of ghosts trapped on paper. It was his proof that he had always been smarter, faster, and richer than those who tried to stop him. But something had changed. For the first time in decades, he wasn't ahead. He was being hunted not by lawmen or politicians, but by someone whose name didn't exist on any document. A man who fought like a warrior, moved like a banker, and vanished like a shadow. Banning's empire was bleeding. 3 of his rail outposts had mysteriously gone bankrupt overnight. His shell companies found their ledgers emptied, sold quietly through third-party transactions. Land deeds were being challenged and overturned by judges across 3 states. The newspaper in Fort Cresswell published a headline that shook the aristocracy. Cherokee investor buys back railroad built on ancestral burial site. No name was listed. Just a seal burned into the paper, the Obsidian Eagle. He hadn't just come to reclaim what was stolen. He came to tear down everything built on lies. And now, the world was watching in towns like Hollow Ridge, Redwater, and Briar Glen. Poor families who had once been forced off their land returned to find homes waiting, paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. But the designs of the homes weren't random. They were exact replicas of the lodges that once stood on Cherokee soil, right down to the carved wooden beams and crescent doorways. Elders wept, children danced, and storytellers sang of a man who rode without a name, wearing a poncho stitched with history and vengeance. Back in Silverback Valley, something else stirred. One night, just before dawn, the rail line that ran through the edge of Banning's estate screamed. With metal, a train that no longer operated, once used to smuggle illegal timber, appeared without warning. It moved slowly, almost like a funeral procession. Its cars were empty. No coal, no smoke, just a single lantern swinging at the rear. Then, as it passed the stone gate of Banning's mansion, it stopped, and from it stepped one man. Not tall, not loud, just steady. His boots hit the earth like drums, and as he approached the main gate, the guards froze, not from fear, but from memory. 2 of them had once worked for the railroad company that buried Nokosi Ridge. They remembered the boy who had survived the fire, and now they stood face to face with the man born from it. They didn't stop him. The mansion doors opened slowly. No gunshots, no threats, just silence. The masked Cherokee millionaire entered Banning's house. like a ghost revisiting the scene of his death. He didn't speak. He walked past golden-framed maps, past marble busts of men who never bled for their land, and stood before the fireplace, where Banning had once toasted to civilizing the wilderness. On the mantel was an old model train crafted from silver, engraved with the names of Banning's rail syndicates. The masked man removed something from his satchel. Not a weapon. A shard of black stone volcanic, smooth, carved with symbols. It was a piece of his old village's ceremonial altar, the only thing that survived the flames. He placed it on the mantel beside the silver train dot, and then he left. When Everett Banning awoke hours later, alerted by a trembling maid, he walked into his study to find every deed, every contract, every proof of his empire's roots burned. Not in a pile, not in ash, but surgically, each page missing only one piece, the part where a signature once legalized the theft. And in the center of his desk, the same obsidian eagle badge once worn by a Cherokee chief, polished and waiting. Banning collapsed into his chair. He had always believed the law was just a game played by the wealthy. That history belonged to the victors. That paper was more powerful than prayer. But now, the paper was gone, and what remained was something no money could bury. Legacy. Outside, the phantom train rolled on, disappearing into fog like it had never existed. But in every town it passed, new fires were lit not to destroy, but to warm the hands of those who had once been left in the cold. And as the sky over Silverback Valley turned a pale red, the land seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Not in fear, but in justice. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come in thunder. It comes on rails. The courthouse in Black Hollow hadn't seen this many people since the war ended. The building itself was nothing more than cracked stone, creaking floorboards, and a leaking roof patched with borrowed tar. But today, it stood like a fortress of reckoning, because on this day, Everett Banning, rail tycoon, land baron, and kingmaker was finally on trial, and the judge presiding over it was Alice Grantham. She entered the courtroom like thunder wrapped in lace. Her gavel carried not in ceremony, but in memory. Her father had died exposing corruption tied to Banning's earliest deals. For years, she had been denied access to his case files. Now, she sat above the very man who had signed her father's death certificate with a handshake and a campaign donation. The masked Cherokee did not appear in the courtroom, but he was there, in every file submitted, in every witness called, in every map, deed, and signature carefully reassembled from the wreckage of silence. His presence was not flesh but force. The attorneys representing Banning scrambled to discredit the documents, but they could not unburn what had already been branded into the hearts of the people. The first witness was Alma the seamstress from Clearwater. She spoke of the letter, the gold, the land that had once belonged to her grandmother and was now hers again. Her voice trembled, but her truth held strong. The second witness was a former member of the Red Gorge gang, now under federal protection. He testified that Banning had paid them under the table through backdoor mining contracts. He detailed the plan to bomb rival railways and even the attempted murder of a tribal council elder who had refused to sell. The courtroom gasped, but Judge Grantham did not flinch. She listened. She weighed, and then she delivered what no one expected: not a verdict, but a mandate. The federal government was to return over 40,000 acres of stolen land to Cherokee descendants, using Banning's seized properties as collateral. The court ordered the dismantling of 3 major rail syndicates connected to the forged deeds. Every dollar laundered through shell companies was to be paid into a tribal education and land restoration trust. The sentence for Everett Banning himself was not death. It was legacy. He would live, but his name would not. His statues, his portraits in halls of commerce, his golden plaques at universities stripped, his rail lines renamed after the rivers they once crossed, and his home turned into a museum of stolen history, curated by the very people he once silenced. It wasn't vengeance. It was memory made permanent. Outside the courthouse, a storm rolled across the plains. Not rain. Dust, dry, hot, electric-like. The kind that came before prairie fires. And in that storm, standing at the edge of the hills overlooking Black Hollow, was the masked Cherokee. His poncho billowed, his hat low, his silence eternal. He watched not with triumph, but with ache. Because justice had come but not without cost. He still carried the scars of Nokosi Ridge. He still heard the screams from that night the soldiers burned his village to ash. He still walked as one who had lost everything and returned only to put the pieces in order for others. That was the difference. The bandits came for silver. He came for the soul. In Fort Cresswell. Bells ring, not for war, not for wealth, but for something older, something the frontier had forgotten. Honored. And across the West, stories began to change. Children no longer drew cowboys with white hats and gold stars. They drew figures with ponchos, riding silent trains, holding books. Instead of guns, seeds instead of bullets. And every tale ended the same, not with blood, but with balance. As the wind carried grit and truth across the valley, the stranger turned. His train waited behind him, empty cars ready for the next journey. But he didn't board it. Not yet. There was one stop left, one final name to face, one last trail that had never been walked. Because while justice had won in the court, redemption was still unfinished in the heart. The train yard at Nokosi Ridge hadn't seen smoke in over 3 decades. What once was a sacred settlement, filled with song, stone carvings, and earth-stained prayer circles, was now a graveyard of rusted rails and charred timbers. But the land still remembered. The wind still whistled through broken wheels. The soil still pulsed beneath cracked ground where ceremony drums had once echoed. That's where he returned. No headlines followed him. No cameras. No crowds. Just silence and sky. He came without his poncho, without the mask, without the sharp lines of vengeance. What remained was a man older now, bare in soul, holding in his hand the single artifact that had survived both fire and time. The black volcanic shard from his childhood altar. He knelt in the ashes of what had been his family's home, where the foundation was still marked by stone, where his mother had sung lullabies and his grandfather once kept watch with stories of warriors, not broken treaties. He placed the shard into the earth. It sank without resistance, like it had always belonged there, waiting to return. And then, slowly, he did something he hadn't done since the day they burned it down. He wept. Not because of what was lost, but because of what had been saved by fire, by silence, by years of careful resistance. The land wasn't just soil. It was memory, and he had guarded it with his fortune, rebuilt it with justice, and watered it with the truth no one wanted to write. Behind him, the train waited. But this time, it didn't carry silver, or documents, or plans for war. It carried seeds, food, tools, books printed in Cherokee, teachers, builders, elders, orphans who had been reclaimed from the shadow of the rail wars. Every passenger was someone who had been touched by injustice, and now returned to rebuild not the past, but a future from its bones. As they stepped off the train, barefoot or booted, wide-eyed or weary, they paused. The man who had brought them, there was not at the front. He was among them. He wore no badge. No name, just worn hands, clear eyes, and the silence of a man who had already done enough. They didn't ask for speeches. They built tents, laid new stones, drew blueprints in the dirt. And slowly, Nokosi Ridge stirred again, not in fire, but in forgiveness. Elsewhere, in cities carved from greed, the name banning faded. Investors distanced themselves. University halls named after him were renamed after judges, teachers, and survivors. A Cherokee youth program was founded in his forfeited mansion, and a small statue was unveiled in Clearwater, not of a war hero, but of a trained lantern with an obsidian eagle perched on top. People passed it every day and whispered different things. Some said the man who wore the mask still walked among them, tending crops in disguise. Others claimed he had vanished across the Atlantic to help other nations rebuild their stolen histories. But one thing was certain. His story had changed the map, not just the one drawn on paper, but the one carved into hearts. And somewhere, deep in the frontier's spine, as wind swept across hills that had once been silent graves, the rails hummed again. Not with iron, not with greed, but with the weight of something sacred. Redemption. Not all stories are written in ink. Some are written in scars, in footsteps, in the space between memory and justice. And this tale of a boy forged in flame who returned as a shadow was. Never meant to end in glory. It was meant to begin again. With every rail reclaimed, with every child returned, with every seed planted where fire once ruled. Frontier redemption wasn't a place. It was a promise, and he kept it.